Okay, assalamu alaikum everyone. Thank you very much for coming today. And once again, thank you very much for having me back into your community, into this masjid. I really appreciate it. It's not often we historians are given the platform to come to a mosque and to speak to the community in that sense. I will try to be as easy as I can while they finish their Jamaat. So for those of you who don't know, my name is Dr. Yaqoob Ahmed. I've been living in Turkey for the last 12 years, but currently I'm doing a postdoc in Tokyo. So I've flown in from Tokyo, and my area speciality is on Abdul Hamid II, which was one of the last sultans of the late Ottoman Empire, and I also look at the ulama. But the collapse of the Ottoman Empire in particular is a subject which is becoming more and more sort of like interesting for people, simply because the current predicament that the region is in at the moment is something that started 100 years ago. And some of the activities, actions, and events that are taking place today, they're still rooted in that 100-year period. They haven't escaped from it. Now, as a historian, one of the things that I have found valuable for me is the sense that initially when I started doing history, I was one of the very few Muslims who was doing it. Muslims generally don't take an interest in history. They think history is boring. They want to be entertained and so forth. And then a large group of scholars would decide to study the tradition. History used to be part of the tradition. It was part of what you call ulum a'la. Ibn Khaldun did tafsir, was an alim, wrote his muqaddama. His student, Al-Makrizi, was an alim, and so forth. In the Ottoman Empire, Alim Jevdet Pasha was an alim, did tafsir, translated Ibn Khaldun, was a historian. At-Tabari, once again, and so on. What you see is that in our tradition, there was a recognition intrinsically that came from the Quran itself, that it's important for you to understand about the past. If you do not understand what happened before you, you can't make sense of who you are right now. We are attached to what comes before us, and this is why Allah Ta'ala in the Quran continuously reminds us of events and people and moments in the past. Now what Allah but what Allah does, astaghfirullah, what Allah Ta'ala does in the Quran is He also gives you a lesson that you may learn from the events of the past. So it's not just mere information. There's a value to this in terms of understanding. And you'll see that Muhammad Iqbal, the famous South Asian philosopher and poet and thinker, he said that the Quran has 3 ayats. The ayats themselves, so each ayah, and in English we've translated them as verses, and that's a correct translation, there's nothing wrong with that. But ayah in its purest form means sign, right? So each ayah in the Quran is a sign for you to reflect over. You read an ayah, you should reflect over that sign. The second ayats he talked about in the Quran were the ayats of nature. That Allah Ta'ala continuously asks you to ponder and think about nature so that you understand your place in the cosmos. Okay? In this sense, Allah Ta'ala talks about, do you not see the stars? And reflect. Now it's interesting, today we can't see the stars anymore. Can you not see, the idea of rain? Then this is intriguing because I have 2 cats at home in London. And I'm always observing their behavior, watching them. And I go, subhanAllah, look at that. Because it reminds me about myself in this cosmos. And so Muhammad Iqbal makes the argument that to some degree that the Quran is in conformity with reality, not in contradiction with it, and that you must understand the Quran in relation to reality, and you must understand your reality, which is nature itself. Now in the modern period, what we're trying to do is tame nature, control it. All the technological things that you're seeing right now, to some degree, is even obscuring our interaction with nature. So if you're a regular human being who doesn't read the Quran, You don't have the opportunities to reflect. And then you don't look at nature around you. You're no longer interested in interacting with it. You've become the big city person where your lives are just machines. And I know this because I live in Tokyo right now, and I see people all the time glued to their phones. It's strange because when I used to live in Istanbul, and we used to take the boat from one end to another, people used to film us going across to the other side, rather than just using their eyes and seeing us go to the other side. They wanted it on their camera, right? Now the problem with technology is what it does is it creates distance, right? And part of being human is that you close the distance, right? In that sense, this is why understanding your nature is important, in that sense. And this is why Allah Ta'ala on many occasions mentions it. And it's for the thinking mind. And then Iqbal says, and the final ayat ayah in the Quran is history. That Allah Ta'ala deliberately mentions people, moments and things in history so that you may learn about them, resonate with them, and so forth. In this sense, history in of itself is in conformity with the reality, hence it's in conformity with nature, and history is in conformity with the ayahs of Allah Ta'ala of His words in the Quran. So all of these things become important. The fact that we as Muslims no longer care anymore, or no longer take an interest, is problematic for me. Because when I'm doing history, your history, our history, is not written by us. It's written by somebody else. And they're telling us not only who you are, but who you were. And not only are they telling you who you were, but they're telling you who you ought to be, right? So you need to have that control and that agency over this in terms of your own narrative, in terms of understanding who you are. Now, many of the ulama, they made the argument that one of the reasons why studying history is important is to understand what it means to belong to the ummah. You are not just part of the ummah of today. There was an ummah of the past. Millions of people who have become Muslim, and because of them we are Muslim today as a collective. That in order to understand what it means to belong to ummah, to that collective, it's not just the issue of the now. That's a very Western modern way of looking at things, just the now. But in fact, we are an ummah that came before, and there's an ummah of the future. You should be responsible over them, the people that have not come yet. And this sounds strange, but whenever I'm studying history, you'll see Muslims making the case that we are doing this for the ummah that have not arrived yet. The ummah of the future, the ummah that we have not seen. In this sense, once you start to understand the notion of ummah in this way, it goes beyond time and space. Beyond time and space. And so this is my next point. Our idea about time. How do we understand time? Now in the West, the idea of time is it's linear, it's flat, it's going upwards like this. I mentioned this the last time I came. Whereas in Islam, we believe it's cyclical, right? That the cosmos will return back to Allah Ta'ala. That we will return back to Allah Ta'ala. That time itself will return back to Allah Ta'ala, right, in this sense. And this is important to understand that, because once you understand that, then you start to understand that maybe there are cycles where human beings go for particular behaviors, where prosperity will come and prosperity will go. Jahiliyyah will come and Jahiliyyah will go. And once you understand that, then you say, how did people deal with this before? How did they deal with it before, right? And then this comes down to my last point about Jahiliyyah. That in Islam, we are a people where ilm is central to our understanding of what it means to be Muslim. Ilm, seeking ilm, is part of Iman, right? It's part of Iman in that sense. So being ignorant is not something which is acceptable in the community. When we look at what's happening post-Gaza, what we see is the misinformation and the disinformation as a way of making people ignorant. You can make people ignorant by them not knowing something. You can make people ignorant by giving them incorrect information. or you can make people ignorant by giving them so much information, they don't know how to make the distinction between what is right and what is not right. As a historian, one of the things I learned was that in our quest to understand and to be knowledgeable, that we have to understand what is the truth, in that context. So, as a historian, to some degree, I keep trying to make the argument that our job is to seek what is the truth, so that we know what happened, so that we know how to place ourselves in this timeline. So regarding Palestine, and we're going to look at some of the things today, in regards to the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, by knowing what the truth is, we can then counter that with the falsehoods that people are talking about in that context, okay? All right, Bismillah. So, we okay? Bismillah, let's go. So, this is Sultan Abdul Hamid II on the left. It's one of the few. There's not many pictures of Abdul Hamid II, but for those of you who don't know, he was probably the last true Ottoman Sultan in the late Ottoman period. Abdul Hamid was in power for 33 years and is known as being the Sultan who basically put the stamp back in regards to the idea of the Khilafah and the Hijaz railway station. The Hijaz railway station as a project was truly unprecedented in regards to it being a fully Ummah project. Never before in the history of Islam did we have a project where a railway station that goes from Istanbul to Hadramaut, Mecca, Medina, Aqsa, in that context, which was paid only by the Ummah. There was no foreign money, there was no loans, the Ummah paid for this globally. 7% of the loans money came from Muslims outside of the Ottoman Empire, predominantly the money came from within the Ottoman Empire, and then all the workers that were making the train station were Muslim. They had to be religious Muslims, they had to be pious. On many occasions they didn't even have wages, but they were still doing it sadaqah jariyah for the sake of Allah Ta'ala. The Europeans critiqued them by saying there's no money in this. Why are the Muslims doing this? There's no profit to be made here. But they still did it for the Hujjaj. Now why this is interesting is because today, once again, people are talking about the Hijaz Railway. The idea that now that Syria has got its form of liberation, that it's possible that this railway station can be linked again. And why that's interesting, why, is because of the transcending of borders. It's a new phenomena. The idea that we can have a railway station that goes back to a period like this in the Ottoman period where something transcends borders. And it's purely, fundamentally, for religious reasons. So the reason why I wanted to let you know that is perhaps to help you understand how the Ottomans are thinking. I'm not trying to say they're good or bad, but just they did have an Islamic vision. That vision was part of their imagination. So Abdul Hamid's in power for 33 years, and then on the right-hand side, or my left, sorry, yes, my left-hand side, you can see that there was a Young Turk revolution that happened. And this revolution was a group of military men who was frustrated perhaps at the fact that Abdul Hamid was maintaining the empire, and what they wanted was to expand the empire. Territories were being lost, and rather than maintaining the status quo, they wanted to get land back. Egypt, parts of the Balkans, and so forth. Now there are many other narratives of why the revolution happened. We can go into that later, but this is a key transition moment in the empire, from going from 33 years of Hamidian rule to what we would say relative stability, to a moment where we have a revolution. And revolutions can be, they can destabilize nations. When a revolution appears, because the infrastructure goes, the leadership goes, the status quo goes, it tends to create opportunities for a change, but even an opportunity for destabilization, right? And so maybe then it requires some level of maturity and understanding how revolutions come into being. Now, the Ottomans do not enter World War I in 1914. In fact, the Ottomans enter World War I in another moment, which is interesting, which is 1911. And I want to start off with this, okay? Because the wars that the Ottomans get dragged into primarily exhaust the region and then create this deconstruction that is taking place in the Muslim world at the time. It's these consistent wars by the European powers that are doing this. A lot of people accuse the Ottomans in regards to industrialization. But industrialization, the idea of making machines to make you go faster, was part of the capitalist worldview. And that capitalist worldview was attached to colonialism. To have machines to go faster, you need to colonize nations to take their resources to go faster. And so when people keep asking me why didn't the Ottomans not think of industrialization, it's because they didn't have the mindset that we're going to go around the world, colonize nations to take their resources because we need to go faster. This was a European conception, and so they were competing with each other because they now need to feed the culture of the industrial movement, because we need more resources and we need to take more resources to become more powerful to go faster. And so you're seeing this competition in Europe. Now the problem with this is that this now is creating an imbalance in Europe to the point that nations are now competing with each other, that who can be the most aggressive, industrial, modern state that can go faster, and who is going to take from everyone else. So in 1871, the Italians become unified as a state, and they now want to be like the British and the French. And in order to survive, what's interesting is the Italian nationalists had a very interesting imagination. They said, bring back the Roman Empire. And they started creating imaginations that we are the Roman Empire. This is intriguing in the Western mindset, that whenever there's this imagination of expanding, of pushing out and taking territory, that the imagination of the Roman Empire is evoked. And we see this in this country too, that the current administration is now evoking this vocabulary about the Roman Empire, right? To what degree these nations are actually continuations of the Roman Empire is up for discussion, but it's part of the imagination that's created. So even they use a imagination, like a past, a moment. For us, it's Islam, during the time of Rasul Sallam. For many of these nations, they're starting to evoke this imagination of the Romans. It's interesting because even in World War I, when the British defeated the Ottomans in the Arab provinces, they started evoking language of the Crusades. That historical moment in the past is used in this context. So the Italians, start to become a player. And fundamentally, Europe has changed a lot. Initially, it's the British and the French that are competing with the Russians, but the unification of Germany upsets the balance of European society. There's a new player in town. And so the Italians in particular, also after these revolutionary moments that are taking place in Europe, want to get in on the game, and so they invade Libya. The French have already colonized Tunisia and Algeria and Morocco. The British have occupied Egypt, so the only area left is Libya in this sense. And the Italians are concerned that if we don't take Libya, the British and the French will. So for the Ottomans, World War I does not begin in 1914. It begins here in 1911, okay? The invasion of Libya. And this is important because the war in Libya is the first time that we see the use of large machinery. It becomes a testing ground. It's the first time we're seeing planes being used, okay, in this context. To drop bombs, they were not successful in that, but they were successful in reconnaissance, similar to what the drones are doing today, in this sense. And they were dropping them indiscriminately in Libya. Now, one of the even more interesting things about the Italians is they believed that Libya would collapse overnight because they were not happy with the Ottoman Empire. That didn't happen. In fact, what we saw is the Sanusi Tariqat aligned themselves with the Ottoman Empire to work together to try to stop the Italian invasion. And this was one of the first times we saw the war of the trenches, which you dug a trench to go into the ground. Now, why they dig in trenches? It's because people are using big machines. So to avoid those machine guns, you dig a trench to go into the ground so that you can't be shot off, right? This is a very unique form of warfare. It hasn't happened before. Now, the Italians were struggling against the Ottomans and the Arabs who were fighting against them. They really were struggling. The Ottomans were being successful in the warfare. And so the Italians did two things. One is they brought soldiers from Eritrea. So this is one of the problems the Ottomans had. The Ottoman population at that time was about 25 million people. So understand, today's Istanbul is 17 million people, maybe 20 million people. The whole Ottoman Empire is 25 million people. The foreign powers, because they've colonized other Muslim areas, can pull soldiers from other parts of the world. And they would usually use those soldiers first. Soldiers from India, Australia, New Zealand, parts of Africa, put them in the front line first, let them get cleaned out, and then we come afterwards. That happened a lot. So another point here is to understand, because sometimes people say, why could the Ottomans not compete? It wasn't about necessarily just technology. It was the manpower. They just didn't have that manpower, right, in this sense. The second thing is that the Italians then agitated. They agitated an instigation in the Balkans. And the Ottomans had to make a choice between continuing to fight in Libya or to abandon Libya, because now the Balkan states have been occupied and Montenegro is kicked off in the Balkans, and we have to make a choice. And they were not capable of fighting a war on two fronts. They didn't have the manpower for that. Now this picture here is a famous picture, and I put it up for a reason. This is Mustafa Kemal and Enver Pasha, I think, with the Sanusi tribe. And a lot of you may know Omar Mukhtar. So you've seen the video, The Lion of the Desert, and so forth. In actuality, it was the Ottomans who taught the locals the guerrilla warfare. So this was the first time that guerrilla warfare was used. So initially, the Italians thought they were winning the war because they would enter, and the Ottoman troops just easily disbanded and retreated. So they thought these people didn't know how to fight, we're going to take this country quickly. And then as they went in deeper, that's when they got bogged down. Right? They got bogged down. And there was a particular strategy that the Ottomans were using in Libya as a way of bogging down, meaning bringing the Italians to get stuck in that sense. It's a risky strategy, guerrilla warfare, especially urban guerrilla warfare, which is the idea that you allow the enemy to come into your towns where there's civilians. And then, because you know the buildings and they don't know the terrain, you can use it as a way of defeating them. Now, by and large, what the Ottomans did in both Libya and in Gaza in 1917 is they took the civilians out. So they removed the civilians so that they didn't become cannon fodder. And then they used the guerrilla strategies in that sense. So why am I mentioning this to you? Because we all know about Omar Mukhtar. We all know the narratives of Omar Mukhtar. We all know the legend of Omar Mukhtar. We forget about the Ottoman presence here. That these were trained soldiers who left weapons behind, trained the local fighters, and then had to trust the local fighters to continue to resist. And the local fighters continue to resist, right, in this sense. And Libya was one of the few nations that after the formation of Arab nationalism, Libya and Algeria continued to maintain a positive Ottoman imagination. That didn't happen in other parts of the Arab world. Okay, so then we get the Balkan Wars in 1912 and 1913. So in the map you can see, so the red parts, Serbia, Bulgaria and Greece, and a little bit of Romania in the north, they came together and decided that we are going to go to war with the Ottomans as a way of not only getting independence, but to get the whole of the Balkans. So if you see the green section on the left, it's a bit blurry for you. So not the section on the right where it says Ottoman Empire, but the green section on the right-hand side to it, which is also the Ottoman Empire, but it's Montenegro, it's Albania, and so forth, and Croatia and Bosnia and so on. And so what basically happened, well, not Bosnia, Bosnia was annexed by Austria. What basically happened is these nations, in their own forms of nationalism, wanted to take this bit of land and wanted to make it part of their own nations. And so they made a deal to fight against the Ottomans as a way of saving these areas. That's what they called it, right? What's interesting here is because this was happening at the same time as Libyan wars, the loss of the Balkans was a humongous loss for the Ottomans. You have to understand that this area here, which today is not in our imagination, was once the center of the Muslim world. It was once the center of the Muslim world. Okay, in terms of prosperity, in terms of multiculturalism, in terms of economy, this is what the West were after. Right? Today we don't think of it like that, in this sense. And when the Ottomans were defeated here, and they were defeated quite badly on the first round because they never expected this, because nobody expected this war, many Muslims were massacred indiscriminately. Okay, I'm going to show you a picture and I'll come back to it. So this is the mosque in Edirne, the Selimiye mosque. It's Mimar Sinan's most famous mosque. That's not in Istanbul, but it's in the second capital city of the Ottoman Empire, in Edirne. This is a group of soldiers who entered that mosque at the time. And basically, Edirne was lost, and Muslims were just running out of the Balkans to come into mainland. And so Istanbul became a hub for refugees. Just streams and streams and streams of refugees coming to Istanbul. And this was a shocking moment for the Ottoman Empire, because if you think, just like today what's happening with Gaza, the exact same thing happened here. Hundreds and thousands of Muslims were massacred. And what the British did, the British and the French decided, is that the Ottomans, they can go in to protect, but they can't invade any of the other countries. So the job of the Ottoman Empire is to maintain the status quo. But if the other states win and they take the land, no problem. No problem. And you'll see this today even, that the idea of a Muslim state trying to push beyond their boundaries and trying to go beyond it, it's disrupting the status quo. Don't do it. But if you combust, then that's okay. The reason why the Balkan map is so important is because in terms of Iraq and Syria, the ambition has always been to Balkanize it. They call it the Balkanization of Syria and Iraq. Even today in Syria, the idea was to have a proto-Sunni state in the north, an Alawi strip on the left, a Kurdish state up here, Bashar al-Assad down here, and a Druzi state. Fracture it. Now, the revolution in Syria has changed that a little bit, and that was because it got a little bit of help from the Turkish Republic, where they're trying to maintain a nation as a whole. Even Iraq was supposed to be federalized. And this is continued idea of making these nations smaller and smaller and smaller because they're easier to manage. So even Sudan, 10 years ago it was one nation. Now it's North Sudan, South Sudan. This is a particular strategy. It's a playbook. Nothing's changed. For the last 100 years, the same thing is happening over and over, right, in this context. So the loss of the Balkans now has already put the Ottomans into shock. Why am I explaining this to you? Because it is important to understand why the Ottomans went into World War I. The reason why they're thinking about the possibility of going into World War I is because of the loss of territory. In 1911, 12, 13. Rapidly, bang, bang, bang. So for them, they have to calculate now that, we're going to have to do something. So, in World War I, the death of Archduke Ferdinand and his wife, they were assassinated. They were from Austria. They were assassinated by Serbian. And this is what is called as the trigger that starts the events of World War I. And the Ottomans had two choices, or three choices. They can either join the Entente powers, which is Britain, France, and Germany. Britain, France, and Russia. But the problem is that these three powers continuously were taking land from the Ottoman Empire and colonizing the rest of the world. So how can you trust them? You couldn't trust them, even though the Ottomans wanted to align with them because they knew a war was coming. Or they can align with Germany, Austria and Bulgaria and try to hope that the rising German power will somehow be victorious in the war, or remain neutral. Remaining neutral is very difficult. They were forced into a position. And once this happens, the Ottomans are in trouble. Okay? And then the Germans go into the Black Sea. So let me show you this map again. The Black Sea area. And the Germans attack the Russians in the Black Sea. Okay? And that attack in the Black Sea changes everything. An aggression on the Russians means now the British and the French are going to get involved in the war. Okay? This is the famous picture of the Jihad fatwa. The Ottomans then declare a Jihad fatwa. The idea of the fatwa was not to mobilize the Muslim soldiers in the Ottoman Empire. They didn't need to do that. It was about mobilizing Muslims around the world. It was about convincing Muslims around the world to not support the British and the French. For example, the British used many soldiers from India, right? And in fact, the British initially had told the soldiers of India that we're going to send you to France. They actually sent them to the Sinai, and they sent them to Mesopotamia, which is today's like Kurdish areas of Anatolia and northern Iraq and northern Syria. So this is the famous Jihad fatwa. This is not Mustafa Sabri. Some people mistake this. And this is, for anyone who's been to Istanbul, this is Fateh. So this is the steps of Fateh Jami, Fateh Mosque. And the next time, and the reason why I'm showing you these photos, because I want you to also understand, when you go to Turkey, when you go to the Ottoman Istanbul, and you see these places, understand the history, understand what's happened here, understand what took place here, understand where you're standing, right? This was the famous call to fight and so forth. Now many historians say that the declaration for jihad was not successful because Muslims around the world did not support the Ottomans in the way that they expected. But I think that's a little unfair. What the fear was is that Muslims would just start fighting around the world. But we've never done that. What Muslims did do is they sent gold, they sent money, they sent resources. In places like India, there were protests. Some people refused to join the army. The intelligentsia were put in prison. So in India, you see the emergence of the Khilafat Committee, a huge movement that emerged to try to save the Ottoman Empire. In fact, the reason why the Khilafat Committee is interesting as well is because when the Ottoman Empire collapses, they are the ones who start the momentum of the creation of the state of Pakistan. Okay? So this all is linked to this moment. Now these are the key moments in World War I. So 1915, Gallipoli, or Çanakkale as they call it in Turkish, which is the Ottoman army defeats the Australians and the British at Gallipoli, right? The first offense. And now these dates are really interesting. So between 1915 to 1918 is the Sinai and the Palestinian campaign. This is when the British really were trying to take Palestine from Egypt. And the Ottomans were holding the fort. And the first time they fought, in 1917, the British were defeated in Gaza, at Rafah. And what's interesting is the strategies the British used. The British used planes to indiscriminately kill as many people as possible. The strategy has not changed. They did not care about the civilians. They wanted to flatten it. So Gaza in its history has been here before, right, in this sense. The Ottomans were successful on this occasion. The reason why Gaza falls later for the Ottoman Empire is because of the Sharif Hussein revolt that takes place later. If that revolt had not happened, the British would not have come from round the back. Okay, so in this context, and I'll show you a map in a second in regards to that. So what's interesting is this is subhanAllah really interesting. The imagination was, if Gaza falls, Palestine falls, or Aqsa goes. And it's so crazy because that's the imagination today again. That if Gaza falls, Aqsa falls, right? In this context. So it's very unique in this sense. Now, the Ottoman Empire, then we have if you see the second set of bullet points, is the Hussein and McMahon correspondence. Okay, so McMahon was a British representative who was sending letters to Sharif Hussein about the possibility of rebelling against the Ottoman Empire. Okay, they needed to find a way of trying to disrupt the sort of like Ottoman defenses in this sense. Sharif Hussein was concerned that the Ottoman Empire were trying to remove him from power, especially the Young Turks. And that's because Sharif Hussein was put into his position of authority by Abdul Hamid II to some degree. But also, he was being made vague promises of the possibility of having an Arab Khilafah. So he bought into this imagination. And this tells you something about the promises of the British and the West. You can't trust those promises. Sharif Hussein was trying to make a deal with McMahon. We've been here before about making deals with power in this context. Now, going back, while Sharif Hussein is sending these correspondence backwards and forwards with McMahon, Sykes and Picot, the British and the French, are making an agreement of, if they are victorious, how to carve up the Arab world, how to make it ours. You will have this, and I will have that. So it's intriguing. On the one hand, they're making promises with Sharif Hussein here, and on the other hand, they're making discussions amongst themselves of how they're going to split it up and take it. Okay? So, there really needs to be some sort of like understanding of Sharif Hussein revolts. Now, why am I calling it Sharif Hussein revolts? It's known in Ottoman studies. Even most contemporary Turkish historians today will call it the Sharif Hussein revolts, not the Arab revolts, because not all the Arabs revolted against the Ottoman Empire. There are many Arabs who are still fighting with the Ottomans on the side of the Ottomans. This is known. So this is specifically, initially at this point, known as the Sharif Hussein revolts, in that sense. Now, afterwards, when the Turkish Republic is formed, unfortunately, some, started calling it the Arab revolts, as a way of calling all the Arabs in. What's unique is up until 1938-39, the name of the last Khalifa was still being said in Mecca, Medina, and Jeddah, in this sense. It's only after World War II where the consolidation happens that this changes, okay, in this context. So, what is Sykes and Picot? This is Sykes and Picot here, okay? So there's a joke. We don't know how true it is, but the joke is that they put a map out, they took out crayons, and they decided this is Iraq, this is Syria, this is going to be Palestine, and so forth. Now, why this was problematic? Because all of a sudden, people who were in Mosul were now considered Iraqi, even though they had a large Turkmen population. People in Halab were now considered being different from people of Gaziantep, even though they would have been part of the same terrain and same type of people. People in Haifa often married people from Damascus. Haifa and Damascus were connected. But now you're drawing these lines, and now people who are here are no longer connected to people over there because there's a line in between them. And so what's interesting about the Arab world in particular, the idea of being Syrian, Iraqi, and so forth was quite strange for them. It wasn't normal because they never identified in this way. Primarily what people did is they identified with religion or what city they were from. I'm from Homs. I'm from Kirkuk. I'm from Baghdad. And that was just as a way, like we do it as well now. People say, where are you from? And I say, I'm a Londoner. I'm from London. Right? They didn't have that national project. This was years and years in the making. So just so that you can see, this is how it looks. And this is a different type of map in terms of what they were trying to do. So the yellow part, as you can see, is the British controlled section. Okay, so once the Ottomans are defeated in 1918 because of the capitulation, and the main reason why the Ottomans capitulated is because Germany lost the war. So once the Germans collapsed, The Ottomans didn't have an ally to continue the fighting in that context, so they also collapsed as a consequence of that. And so what you see is these are the plans of Sykes and Picot. And the idea is the red area is given to Russia, which is the Caucasus. The green area, which is parts of today's Anatolia, parts of Turkey, will be given to the Italians. The lighter green area was to be given to the Greeks. The blue area, which was Syria and parts of Turkey, would be given to the French. And the the orange area was supposed to be given to the British. And the British primarily had an interest in two places. One was Iraq, and the other was Palestine. Palestine, because Bayt al-Maqdis was international, it was an international symbol for the competing powers. And Iraq, because they discovered oil. And oil started to become important. It's a real shame, because if the Ottoman Empire had survived, if it had survived and they had oil, we could have been looking at a very different region right now. This is why I started the story of the Hijaz railway station, to help you understand that the Ottomans, irrespective of what people think, but Islam was something that was important for them, right? Now, here, where you see Palestine, is under international control. It's under international control, but fundamentally what that means is that is under British control, right? That is under British control. And so what we see is the Balfour Declaration, okay, which is the agreement that is made by the British with the Rothschilds to some degree. And this declaration is really important and interesting, because what does the declaration say? His Majesty's government view with favor the establishment in Palestine, so they recognize there's a place called Palestine, of a national home for the Jewish people, and will use their best endeavors to facilitate the achievement of this object, it being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine. It says the word non-Jewish communities. It doesn't say Arabs, it doesn't say Muslims, it says non-Jewish communities. Now this is important, because when you don't have a name, you don't exist. Okay? So it's mentioned the area of Palestine, but it hasn't mentioned the Palestinian people. It's mentioned the land of Palestine, but it hasn't mentioned the Muslims or the Arabs. It's totally eradicated them in terms of their existence. Okay? And I give an example. For example, Allah Ta'ala has called us Muslim. He's given us that name. That's why it's important to be Muslim. Now the distinction between the nation state and what it means to be Muslim is that here the nation state doesn't determine who you are, it establishes who you are not. Right? Now what do I mean by that? When people say to me in England, are you English? What does it mean to be English? They can't tell you. They struggle. Oh, this is what it means to be English. This is our culture. This is our tradition, but they struggle. But they can tell you what it means not to be French. They can tell you what it means not to be German. They can tell you what it means not to be Arab or Muslim. They can tell you what it means not to be something. That's the idea of the nation state in many ways. And so even now in Turkey, if you squeeze somebody, what does it mean to be Turkish? It's a bit challenging, but they can tell you what they are not, because that's how nationalism operates to some degree. Now Islam does not operate like that. Islam, you determine who you are. La ilaha illallah, Muhammadur Rasulullah. You've already established who you are first, not who you are not. Right? So when you have this construction taking place at the time in the world, you will see that there is a tension between a natural identity that what came before and this. So now what we see in the creation of these nation states, and I want you to look at this map before, is you can see that the lines are blurry still. The British and the French didn't clearly designate what should belong to what. And now, after the US invasion of Iraq, and then the war in Syria, the blurring of the lines are happening again, where people are finding it difficult to make distinction. And this region, in a really bizarre and strange way, is going and falling back into an imagination which existed before. This is, in 100 years, what you could say, and I remember speaking to a Palestinian academic by the name of Rifa Abul Hajj, and he wasn't religious. And he writes about the 18th century Ottoman Empire. He said, not a single nation state that has emerged from the Ottoman Empire has been successful in its national project. Not one. Both Muslim and non. Both Muslim and non. They struggled continuously, right, in this sense. And this is the tensions in the national borders. Now, why is this unique? Because of three things. Number one, Islam. Number two, globalization. Globalization is making the world smaller. People are moving around. And number three, migration. The wars are forcing people to migrate once again. They're moving around, and it's disrupting these areas in this sense. Now, why is all of this important? Because all of this that you just seen right now is created the foundations for the region that we have today. The region that we have today. And many people are unaware of what was taking place in this war period that has created this fracture. But prior to 1911, this was all one region, one people, right, in that sense. It was a cosmopolitan, multi-ethnic empire in this context. Now, I'm not saying the empire is coming back, but it's very interesting. I was listening to a music the other day. It was from Abdul Majid, the first Ottoman Caliph in 1859. And the music has been stolen by Star Wars. Even that imagination is not given to them. So when I was listening, I said, that sounds like Star Wars. They said, yeah, but the Ottomans did it first in this context. So there's a lot here in terms of the memory that we are oblivious to. If we understand clearly, and I'm trying to just give you an overview today, my hope is you'll go away and start reading about this. I really want you to read about this, to understand exactly what happened, because this sounds strange. In the region, people have not forgotten. They have not forgotten. It's in their blood. They remember it. But it's us here in this part of the world who are from many parts of these regions that have forgotten in terms of what's happening and so forth. And so then we don't know how to place our politics in relation to this, right? So there. So this was just a brief overview I wanted to introduce to you, because I know it's hard in the masjid to listen to someone like me for going on for a long time. So I really appreciate the fact that you gave me, it says 15 minutes. So I've been talking alone for 15 minutes with the kids running around. So thank you very much. If there's any questions you want to ask, feel free to do so. But I really appreciate it. Assalamu alaikum. Alaikum salam. Barakallah feek. Thank you. Yeah. Yeah. So the question for those of you who didn't hear is, like, in terms of contemporary history, and this is a really great question, because anything post-Ottoman Empire is considered part of political science. Very rarely, I mean, it's history actually. So the 67 war and so forth are all considered as part of the realm of political science. And very rarely does it operate within the realm of history, even though it is. And that's written in Western academia. It's not written by us. So still fundamentally, all the books and all the ideas are written within the Western academic space about what happened at that moment. And so they're written from a particular perspective. Like, I'll give you an example just about the Ottoman Empire. Turkey writes a lot about the Ottoman Empire, and it should. But Ottoman history departments are primarily found in Western universities. You're not going to find Ottoman history departments in Pakistan. I just came back from Malaysia. Ottoman historians don't exist. And yet, I'm living in Tokyo, and they have 23 Ottoman historians in Tokyo, and not one in Malaysia. it tells you something about, because Japan sees itself as part of the Western Bloc, the Ottoman studies and Islamic studies, they were Western projects and Western enterprises in the way that they were writing about the Muslim world at a particular time. The State of Israel writes extensively in the field of Islamic studies and Ottoman studies. And the only Muslim nation that can compete with that is Turkey. The rest of the Muslim world has sort of abandoned that. And so even narratives of 67 and so forth are to some degree abandoned in the collective imagination because of the trauma of these losses that took place. And so a lot of it is still written in the Western academic spaces. And so when we're going into that, to be fair, there's a lot of good work there, but it requires Muslim scholars to go into that and bring it back and then present it to the communities. It really requires that. And we really should be writing our history. Really should be. I can speak to kids today who know nothing about 9/11. And I'm a 9/11 generation. I know a world before 9/11. I know a world after. October the 7th happened. And usually what people do is they'll write history in real time. They know that October the 7th is a moment, they'll be writing this history already. And so we should also, it sounds strange, be writing the history now about post-October 7. Why? Because the Zionists are aware of this, so they're putting their propaganda out continuously, because in 10 years' time, their narrative will be the official narrative. People will forget everything else. That will be the narrative that's bludgeoned. So even now, most people who are historians, this is why when Khaldun is writing, and I said Makrizi, they're writing even for the now, because they know that memory is malleable, and memory is interesting because the minute you get something, it's already you're losing it. So this talk I've given you, you'll go away and you'll forget 90% of what I said. Inshallah, you don't, right? So this is the malleability of memory. This is why we write things down, right? And even when we say the zikr of Allah Ta'ala, who's going to forget Allah Ta'ala? But we do. So we got to keep saying the name of Allah Ta'ala and so forth. So there's something about insan, alhamdulillah, there's a rahmah from Allah that He made us forget, because the brain couldn't handle it if we didn't. But the fact that memory is needed, this is why the documenting this is needed. And I think as a community, one of the things I'm saying is, for example, we don't have textbooks for children at school. I can't write those for you, but we can write it as a community. The community can come together and write children's books for history at children's, so they can do it. Number two, we should be documenting our history right now, so that we don't allow the other side to write for us. I'll give you an example just quickly. Here, the British were writing a lot of pieces of propaganda that was being sent at the time. If you looked at that archival material, you'd believe it as being true, even though it's propaganda. So everything that's coming out in the newspapers today, everything that's coming out in Twitter today, and all the statements that are being said by politicians, even though we know it's not true, it's misguidance, in 20 years' time, the next generation will accept it as being true, right? So this is why I want more and more kids to really be invested in this, because this is not just about us, it's about the ummah of the future, inshallah. So that was a great question. Thank you very much. Go Sheikh Shinawi, then you. Yeah.
Very quickly, do you recall other examples of sort of appropriation of our history that isn't credited back to us? Anything come to mind? I can't relate to Star Wars. I'm not a Star Wars guy.
So actually what's interesting is when you watch even things like the Chronicles of Narnia, which sound bizarre, but Aslan, for example, the lion in Narnia, Aslan is a Turkish word. Right now, Aslan is supposed to represent Isa alayhi salam in the narrative. But when you look at the Chronicles of Narnia and Prince Caspian, they're supposed to be Muslims. The Lord of the Rings, they have a particular representation of Muslims in it. So there's continued. It sounds with Dracula. It's always the notion of Fatih, right? And this is really interesting because when I was in England, I think I mentioned this the last time I was here, there was a poster when Brexit was happening that if you don't Brexit, the Turks are coming. And this was evoking the memory of Sulaiman al-Qanuni. Now, most Muslims in England didn't understand this, but it was from osmosis in the DNA of the English people. They understood that trope. in that sense. So it's virtually everywhere. I watch anime and so forth, and one of the interesting things is, like, if you watch One Piece, like, well, some of the characters are really interesting. That there's a woman called Big Mom. She's Napoleon, and then Whitebeard is Julius Caesar. So even here, okay, Pirates of the Caribbean, they're all Muslim. What they call pirates were Muslim naval men. So Jack Sparrow is a Muslim naval officer. Barbarossa is Baba Oroch from the Ottoman Empire, right? Hayreddin Pasha. So even in the movies, what's interesting is how they extract the Islam out, and then they create the facade and so on. And so even in our popular culture, in our fiction and popular culture, we are not writing in a way in which we are telling our kids stories that are from Islam. And when you travel around the Muslim world, they wrote stories that had a moral to it, that would encourage people to understand the values of Islam. Okay, so even here in our fiction, and you can only do fiction by drawing from an existing repository. You know, reality is wilder than your imagination in this sense, right? And when they did Star Wars, George Lucas, Star Wars is really interesting because the rebellion in Star Wars is supposed to represent the Vietnamese and the Palestinians. And the dark side is supposed to represent the technological empire, which was the British and the USA. George Lucas knew this. He was aware of this. And he did it in this way because he was critical as a Democrat of the empire in that sense. So even there, it's interesting that the liberals are aware of this narrative and Muslims are kind of concerned about it. So it's everywhere. It's just, it requires people to be well read. And we Muslims really need to invest in this. So we should be doing something in the communities to encourage this sort of thought process. Because in the West, to be an intellectual, they encourage you to do history. But they're pricing us out. They're pricing us out of history. It's becoming too expensive. So most Muslims, I've said this before, my mother forgive me, but she said to me, who's going to pay you to think? Get a proper job. Right? And it's true, I don't get paid to I'm not making enough money to think. But alhamdulillah, there are people in our communities who are thinking on behalf of this ummah, who are telling them that this is what's happening and so forth. And I can tell you this now, studying history has made me so enriched as a person because I understood what it means to be human. I understood that I am insan like millions of people before me, and that fundamentally I'm a speck. I'm just this in that narrative. I don't want us to be remembered in Islamic history as the people that did nothing. Okay? In our long history, there are many people who did wonderful things. Let us not go down as the Muslims who did nothing, right? So being jahil is not sufficient for us. So yeah. You had a question, brother? Yeah. It's a great question. So for those of you who didn't hear the question is, how can we verify the authenticity of information and knowledge that's being produced on these YouTube videos and so forth? Fundamentally, we would always ask for the evidence. What's the evidence? So even us as Muslims, we may have a bias towards a person, or bias towards a nation, or bias towards a group of people. But our fundamental objective is to know what is the truth. So when we're doing our politics, and when we're doing our history, if we're not seeking for the truth, we just want to believe in something because it's in agreement with how I feel, it's a dangerous route, even if the person is correct. We have to continuously ask, what is the evidence on that? How did you come to that conclusion? How did you make that opinion, right? So sometimes we can hear even Muslims on podcasts telling you these wonderful stories that feel believable. But the job of us should be, I want to believe you, and you're the expert, no doubt about it. But can you explain to me how you came to that thought process? Can you explain to me what evidences did you have to make that opinion so that I can also have a rounded opinion? And so any works that are not presenting evidences for you, that are not showing the sources of where the information came from that you can verify, then that's where I think we have to be careful. And most YouTube videos, most movies, and Twitter, it lacks that verification. So for example, on Twitter, I never put an opinion up unless if I verified it. Even if it agrees with me, I won't do it. And we've learned in Islam, regarding, Sheikh Shinawi will tell you regarding hadith literature, that we have to be certain in where it's come from before propagating it. And because we are people who speak the truth, we can make mistakes, but if the endeavor is to speak the truth, then there should be an evidence that can back that. And so most works in politics and in history, I think the next stage of political and historical literacy for Muslims ought to be that when they speak to their speakers, that they can provide where this information came from, so that we understand how they formulated that opinion. Because if they can teach us how they formulated that opinion, then we can also learn how to formulate a good opinion based on that. So that's what I would say. Yeah. Yes, Prof. Yeah. Absolutely. So the two things, the first question is about the issue of language and the loss of it. I think this is a real problem. Like for many of us who don't speak Ottoman Turkish or can read Ottoman Turkish, we really do struggle in being able to verify that. This is why we've become specialist historians, where we're looking at the evidence and looking at the languages and learning the languages ourselves. There are many people in Turkey who know the language, who can put that forward. I would say in terms of your children, make sure that they know many Islamic 8 languages, not just English. It's to the detriment. The early Ottoman ulama in the Ottoman period, their curricula before any education was to teach children languages and good manners. Once they learned languages and they had good manners, then when they taught them other subjects, they were able to read in multiple languages themselves. They had the tools to do it because they had those languages, and then they would give them training. So the early years, the kids, make sure they learn as many languages as possible, because if they restricted in languages, they become deficient. My friend's daughter, she speaks Russian because her mother is Russian. She speaks Arabic because her father's Arabic. She speaks Turkish because she lived in Turkey. And then she's watching English TV shows. She has 4 very powerful languages under her table. So it helps her. So when she gets older, she'll be able to look at as many sources as possible. Now, we are trained of looking at the languages and sources. Ottoman Turkish is still taught in Turkey. And Arabic as a language still exists. So there are those sources. Where we may struggle is some of the more languages like Greek, Armenian, and so forth, right? And I encourage Muslims to learn those too. In regards to the TV show, I think you're right. I think the TV show creates an interest, so I don't mind it. But I think we should all be smart enough to understand it's TV. Like parents come to me and say, the kids are watching cartoons. I said, they're cartoons, don't worry about it. They'll grow out of it. If your children are being influenced by cartoons, then what are you doing as a parent that they can't understand that this is not real? But you'd be saying that, but I went to Texas recently, to the Dallas studios, and people, when JR was shot in the TV show, Americans were turning up thinking he lived there for real. Now, what's going on here? We should be able to make the distinction that this is a TV show. It can help us in terms of a motivating factor, but what it should do is encourage us to actually go back to the books and read it. I think that's it. It's entertainment. It has a good moral value to it, but it's entertainment, for sure. You have, sure.
I know you said in the Balfour one of the agreements.
Yeah.
And you said something about how when they put in like non-Jewish, that excluded everybody. So I was just wondering, like, can you expand on that? Because I was just a little bit confused.
Yeah. So the idea is that they mentioned the Jewish population specifically, but by not mentioning the Palestinians, they made the Palestinians invisible. By saying non-Jewish, it can mean anyone and everyone. It doesn't mean the Palestinian here. So then it doesn't indicate that the Palestinians have a right to be here because they're not mentioned at all. So that's the reason. Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Yes, brother. Barakallahu feek. Yeah. Yeah. It's a great question. So the question was by examining the Ottoman Empire, what sort of factors can we see to sort of like help the Ummah understand in regards to the future, perhaps, in this sense? And this is going to sound harsh, but being in America, but I'm going to say it anyway. People keep asking me, could the Ottomans not see their decline? Could they not see it? Could they not see it's happening in front of their eyes? I'm going to say something interesting to you. Can you not see that America is declining? Can you not see it in front of your eyes? If you look at what's happening in Gaza, if you're looking at the popular culture, if you're looking at, you had two presidential candidates at one point who are over 70. What's happening with the politics? What's happening with the morality? What's happening with it? It's in trouble. It's in trouble. And so as a result of that, if something is happening in this civilization, if this civilization is now being pushed to the edge, where the concern would be that there's going to be an implosion, then what's the alternative? Now's the alternative to put Islam as a civilization back onto the map. Now's the time to really have the conversation of people to help them understand Islam civilizationally, not just as a religion, that Islam as a civilization. Somebody asked me in Japan, it was an older gentleman, and he said, "Do you think you're better than me?" And I said, "Why do you say that?" And he goes, "I have an Egyptian friend who said to me that because you're not Muslim, you're going to Jahannam." Right? And I sort of scratched my head and I said, the Egyptians are always making my life interesting. And then I said to him, I don't think I'm better than you. I don't. Because it's not like Muslims are not going to Jahannam either. So there's not a monopoly here. I don't think I'm better than you, but I think Islam is better for you. I believe that. I believe that if the Japanese people had Islam, it would make you better. I believe that. Let me explain it to you. And then he said to me, I believe you. I believe you're sincere in your belief. And in this sense, Islam, even in America, this sounds bizarre, the empire is declining. Islam could save them. Islam can save them. There are people converting in this country right now because of what's happening in Gaza. So now is the time to be Muslim. And it doesn't mean just, praying 5 times a day. It's about intellectually showing the dunya in terms of what we've achieved, what we've done, not having an inferiority complex, and showing that we are still here. And the strength of Islam is not in our scientific advancement. It's that we are morally and ethically different. That we have a moral and ethical basis, which is in agreement with our fitrah. This is the key. That Western civilization has morally and ethically lost its way, and that Muslims are still standing. So the key is not like, what can I see happening in the Muslim world? I'm looking at the Ottoman Empire and seeing how that was, and I'm looking at the Americans, and I'm saying they're in trouble. And I don't know how long they have. It could be 50 years, 60 years, 70 years. That's not my concern. But anyone who can't see what's going on right now in terms of the nudity, the LGBT, the popular culture, the indiscriminate killing, people not feeling safe, the greed, even now the current president, this is telling you that this is a civilization in real trouble. And the idea that China should just replace it, we still exist, Yani. We have something to offer this dunya. This is why Allah Ta'ala praises us. He praises us because we're supposed to give the dunya Islam. It's in conformity with our fitrah. So I think this is my takeaway from this. The more I look at it now, that this is what I believe. Yes. Yeah, go for it. Yeah.
And it kind of like the way like they taught it, it just painted the Ottoman Empire as like bloodthirsty killers.
Yeah, yeah.
And I just like wanted to know like what exactly happened.
So that's a bit more complicated. That is a great question, and that's a bit more complicated. I will say the way that they've presented to you is an oversimplification. And I will speak to you about that in person because I need a bit more time here in this sense. But that is a great question because unfortunately, one of the things is that question has become politicized. So it's very difficult to do the history and show the complexities on both sides. Now, usually genocides are pretty straightforward. There is no complexity here, like in the case of the Palestinians. But in the Armenian case with World War I and so forth, and it all combusting in, and as I mentioned to you about the Balkan Wars and the migration of Muslims that have come in, it's really created a really messy scenario of which unfortunately the Armenians became, an entity that became, they saw the brunt of the massacres that happened across the board, by the way, because that was a unique moment. The uniqueness of World War I is a contingency moment. No one could have anticipated that. For the Ottomans, the war begins in 1911 and it ends in 1924. That's a long period of time of just continuously fighting. Okay, and we've never seen that before. And the Ottomans have never seen that before. And so nobody had anticipated World War I, right? And in Islam, when we teach history, we talk about patterns and cycles, but then there are contingencies. These are unique moments that you can't foresee, like a pandemic, like an earthquake, like Nubuwa, and like wars, where, the Super Bowl, you've got two teams playing each other, but we still don't know who's going to win, right? And you have these moments like World War I, where two entities come together. So October the 7th, even though the Israelis have totally flattened Gaza, the impact of that, we still don't know what the victory is, because the manifestations of that are difficult to see. And World War I is that moment in history, because I give an example. In World War I, the British at 1924 were at the highest of their empire. By 1944, the empire is gone. Nobody anticipated that. So sometimes you can see the decline moments, and sometimes they just combust. And so the theories of rise and decline are supposed to just help you, because just like not every human being sees a full life cycle, not every empire will see a full life cycle. Actually, the question I always tell people is rather than asking about Ottoman decline, they should ask, how did they remain in power for 600 years? Because nobody's done that. How do you remain in power for 600 years, right? But your question's a great one, and I really do want to answer it. And I'll explain it to you later in more detail. I remember you from before. We've had our conversations. I'm really happy you're here again.
Do you know of any Muslims who are studying the Mughal Empire?
So I know that Salih Bashir, I think, from Dar al-Qasim, is working on something in the Mughal Empire. He's the one that I'm aware of. I know that there are some brothers in Princeton who are working on Muslims in India, but I think what they're working on is more 19th century, less so Mughal. The uniqueness of the Ottomans obviously is the Turkish Republic studies it, whereas in India that's not the case, and nor is it the case in Pakistan. And also the Ottomans were around for longer, so then it gives you a larger breadth of that. So, yeah, that's right. Yes, sir.
Yes, 1911 to 1914,
Mm.
during the Umar Mukhtar's war with
Yeah.
Libya. Was Libya under the Ottoman Empire then?
By 1914, no. So 1911, yes. And then the Ottomans had to leave. They were still under the Ottoman sphere of influence, but they were not under direct Ottoman control anymore.
So was that war fought alone by the Libyans?
So the Libyan people were fighting alone, yeah. So the Ottomans basically left behind weapons, gave them tactics, said, we can't really save you here, you're going to have to deal with it yourself. And then there was a war of resistance by the Libyan people. Yeah, yeah.
I'm afraid I might be asking for a simple answer to a complicated
Yeah.
question. Can you suggest any sources that a layman can go to learn accurate history with minimal propaganda?
Yeah, so the question is like the sources that I can advise so that we don't get caught up in the propaganda. That's tough, unfortunately. I mean, history is a discipline, right? This is a vocation. And in Islam, we usually teach people that books are written to be taught. In the West, books are written to be read. So people have the belief that they can just pick up a book, read it, and they know what happens. But in fact, we're continuously checking and counter-checking, fact-checking all the time. This is why being in the classroom is important. What I usually say, though, is I will, with the organizers here, I'll give them a list of books. Or you can find me on the internet. If you just write my name, Yaqoob Ahmed, you'll find me on the internet. Send me an email, and then I'll send you a list of books you can read, and I'll tell you what concerns I have with those books, just to help you navigate it. There's a lot of information that a lot of academics do, which are very good, by the way. I'm not going to say that all academic works are incorrect. My main concern is just that we are not writing for ourselves, right? So that's the main issue I have. But there are a lot of good books in academia, for sure.